Whispers hissed through the Grand Plaza ballroom like venomous snakes. Penelope Russo, drowning in heavy white silk, stood entirely alone under the unforgiving chandeliers. She was a plus-size pawn surrounded by sleek, predatory mob wives waiting for the inevitable punchline. Everyone expected Leonardo Castiglione, the ruthless head of the syndicate, to take one look at his forced bride and walk away laughing. Instead, the lethal Don stepped forward, his eyes completely devoid of mercy. He didn't sneer. He didn't mock her. He pulled her trembling body flush against his chest, drew his customized beretta, and slammed it onto the pristine tablecloth. The entire ballroom went dead silent. The air in Don Carmine Castiglione's mahogany-paneled study was thick with the suffocating scent of Cohiba cigars and stale espresso. Leonardo Castiglione, 32 years old and the newly minted head of the family, stared at the men sitting across from him with barely concealed lethal intent. "You want me to what?" Leonardo's voice was a low, gravelly rasp that usually sent grown men scrambling for the exits. "It's the only way to solidify the peace, Leo," wheezed Silvio Russo, a sweating, pathetic excuse for a capo whose gambling debts had nearly compromised the entire Eastern Seaboard operation. "The commission demands a blood tie. My daughter Penelope. She is of age. She is untouched. A marriage between our houses wipes my slate clean and proves to the feds that the families are united." Leonardo stood up, the leather of his chair groaning under the sudden shift. He walked over to the heavy velvet drapes, looking out at the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan. He knew Silvio had a daughter. Everyone in their insular, dangerous world knew about Silvio's daughter. They didn't call her the Russo princess. Behind closed doors, in the viciously shallow circles of La Cosa Nostra, they called her the Russo pig. "You're offering me Penelope," Leonardo said, turning slowly, his jaw ticking. "You owe the syndicate $4 million, Silvio. You sold out our docks to the Albanians to cover your tracks, and to save your own pathetic skin from being flayed alive, you are offering me a girl who hides in the pantry. I am the head of the Castiglione family. My wife is meant to be a queen, a weapon, a symbol of absolute perfection, not a punchline." Silvio swallowed hard, his face pale. "She is obedient, Don Leonardo. She will never question you. She will give you heirs. Please, the commission has already voted." Leonardo's eyes flicked to his consigliere, Dante. Dante gave a slow, grim nod. The vote was binding. Refusing a direct mandate from the commission to settle a blood feud meant a brutal, all-out war. Leonardo could win it, but the cost in blood and territory would be astronomical. "Fine," Leonardo spat, walking back to the desk and leaning over it, invading Silvio's space until the older man trembled. "I will marry her. But understand this, Silvio. Your debt is paid, but you are out. You step down. You retire to Florida. And if I ever see your face in my city again, I'll feed you to the stray dogs in the Bronx." 10 miles away, in a crumbling, heavily guarded estate in Brooklyn, Penelope Russo sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor. She was 23, and she had spent her entire life trying to be invisible. In a world where women were traded like currency, valued entirely by their cheekbones, their waistlines, and their ability to look stunning beside men with blood on their hands, Penelope was an anomaly. She was soft where she was supposed to be sharp. She was heavily built, carrying weight in her thighs, her stomach, her upper arms. Her face was round, framed by thick, unruly dark curls. She had beautiful, expressive brown eyes. But nobody ever looked at her eyes. They looked at the way her flesh pressed against the seams of her clothes. She had spent years enduring the quiet cruelty of her aunts, the snide remarks of her cousins, and the utter, dismissive disappointment of her father. The door to her bedroom flew open. Her father, Silvio, stood there, smelling of cheap whiskey and fear. "Pack your things," he barked, not meeting her eyes. "You're getting married on Saturday." Penelope's heart dropped into her stomach. Married? Papa, to who? Leonardo Castiglione. The name hit her like a physical blow. Leonardo Castiglione was a monster. He was known as Il Falco, the Falcon. He was breathtakingly handsome, brutally intelligent, and utterly devoid of a conscience. He was known to date supermodels, Russian ballerinas, women who looked like they were carved from marble and glass. "Papa, no," Penelope whispered, her voice trembling. She stood up, her hands clutching the fabric of her oversized sweater. "He'll hate me. He'll lock me away. You know what they say about me. You know how they look at me." "It's done, Penny," Silvio shouted, slamming his hand against the doorframe. "It's this, or I get a bullet in the back of my head. For once in your life, do something useful for this family. You will put on the dress, you will walk down the aisle, and you will keep your mouth shut." He turned and left, leaving Penelope alone in the stifling silence of her room. She walked over to the full-length mirror. She took a shuddering breath and lifted the hem of her sweater. She looked at the rolls of her stomach, the stretch marks painting silver lines across her hips. She squeezed her eyes shut as a hot tear slipped down her cheek. She was being sent to a slaughterhouse, wrapped up in a white ribbon. She knew exactly what Leonardo Castiglione would do to her. He would humiliate her, discard her, and keep her as a prisoner in her own home, a living testament to her father's failures. Over the next 3 days, her life became a blur of humiliating preparations. The Castiglione family sent their own tailors. An icy, sharp-featured woman named Madame Beatrice measured Penelope with expressions of profound distaste. "Draw the corset tighter," Beatrice snapped at her assistants. "I can't breathe," Penelope gasped, her ribs aching as the heavy satin and boning crushed her lungs. "Beauty is pain, Miss Russo," Beatrice replied coldly. "Though we are attempting a miracle here, we must at least give Don Leonardo an illusion of a waistline." Penelope bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, refusing to let them see her cry. She retreated into the quiet, observant shell she had built over 2 decades. She was fat, yes, but she wasn't stupid. If she was going to survive in the lion's den, she had to stop acting like prey. The Cathedral of St. Patrick was heavily guarded. Black SUVs lined the streets, and men with earpieces and bulging jackets stood at every corner. Inside, the pews were packed with the most dangerous men and women in the country. The heads of the 5 families, the Chicago outfit, and the Detroit partnership were all in attendance. The organ music swelled, deep and foreboding. The massive wooden doors opened, and Penelope stood at the threshold. She wore a custom-made gown that was a masterpiece of tailoring, yet she still felt like an imposter. The dress was heavy silk, with a sweetheart neckline and long lace sleeves to cover her arms. Despite the cruel corset, there was no hiding her size. She was a large woman, and as she took her first step down the aisle, the whispers began. They rustled through the cathedral like dry leaves in a graveyard. "Silvio really screwed him over. Look at her waddle. I give it a week before Leo takes a mistress. Look at Isabella over there. She's practically laughing." Penelope kept her eyes fixed firmly on the altar, her hands shaking so violently that her bouquet of blood-red roses trembled. She forced herself to put one foot in front of the other. At the end of the aisle stood Leonardo. He wore a custom Tom Ford tuxedo that fit his broad, muscular frame flawlessly. His dark hair was swept back, and his sharp, aristocratic jawline was set in stone. But it was his eyes that terrified her. They were a pale, icy blue, and as they locked onto hers, she saw the sheer, unadulterated fury radiating from them. He wasn't just angry, he was dangerous. When Silvia reached the altar, he hastily thrust Penelope's hand toward Leonardo. Leonardo didn't even look at the older man. He stared at Penelope. Up close, his presence was overwhelming. He smelled of bergamot and danger. Slowly, deliberately, he took her hand. His grip was entirely too tight, a silent warning. The priest began the ceremony. It was a traditional Catholic mass, but the holy words felt profane in a room filled with murderers. Penelope's breathing was shallow. She was sweating beneath the heavy fabric, terrified she might pass out. "Do you, Leonardo, take Penelope?" "I do," Leonardo said, his voice ringing out loudly, cutting off the priest. It wasn't a vow, it was a threat. "Do you, Penelope, take Leonardo?" "I do," she whispered, her voice barely carrying past her own lips. "Speak up," Leonardo murmured, his voice so low only she could hear it. "You are a Castiglione now. Act like it." She swallowed hard, lifting her chin. "I do," she said, louder this time. "You may kiss the bride." Penelope froze. She closed her eyes, bracing for a quick, disgusted peck. Instead, Leonardo's large, calloused hand cupped her jaw. His fingers dug slightly into her soft cheek. He leaned down, and his lips captured hers. It wasn't romantic. It was a brand. It was fierce, consuming, and aggressively territorial. A shockwave went through Penelope's body. He pulled back, his icy eyes searching her flushed face, before turning to face the congregation. The reception was held at the Grand Plaza. The opulence was sickening. Fountains of champagne, towers of seafood, and a live orchestra playing in the corner. Penelope sat rigidly at the head table beside her new husband. They hadn't spoken a single word to each other since the altar. Leonardo was busy fielding congratulations from men who kissed his ring while giving Penelope thinly veiled looks of pity or amusement. Then Isabella approached. Isabella Romano was Leonardo's known associate and rumored longtime mistress. She was breathtaking, tall, willowy, with raven hair and a body poured into a skin-tight scarlet dress. She walked with the confidence of a woman who owned the room. "Leonardo," Isabella purred, leaning over the table, her cleavage prominently displayed. She kissed him on both cheeks, lingering far too long. Then she turned her gaze to Penelope, her lips curled into a vicious, patronizing smile. "And this must be the new bride," Isabella said, her voice carrying loudly over the music. Several nearby tables fell silent, eager for the drama. "Congratulations, Penelope. We were all so surprised. But I suppose a man needs a hearty, sturdy girl to keep the house warm while he's out doing the real work." A few low chuckles erupted from the surrounding mobsters. Penelope felt the blood drain from her face. She looked down at her hands, the familiar, crushing weight of humiliation settling over her. She waited for Leonardo to laugh with them. She waited for him to agree. Instead, the sound of glass shattering echoed like a gunshot. Leonardo had slammed his crystal tumbler onto the table, shattering it completely. The music faltered. The chatter died instantly. Every eye in the ballroom snapped to the head table. Leonardo slowly stood up. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and wiped a drop of whiskey from his hand. He looked at Isabella, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "What did you say, Isabella?" Leonardo asked, his voice deadly quiet. Isabella's confident smile faltered. I was just congratulating the bride, Leo. I meant no disrespect. You called my wife sturdy. You implied she is a housemaid." Leonardo stepped around the table. He stood directly in front of Isabella. He was a predator, towering over a very foolish prey. "This woman," Leonardo said, gesturing to Penelope without looking away from Isabella, is Penelope Castiglione. She is the donna of this family. She carries my name. She sits at my right hand." He reached into his jacket, and the metallic clack of a gun being cocked made half the room flinch. He didn't point it at Isabella, but he set the heavy black beretta on the white tablecloth, right in front of Penelope's plate. "My wife is not a punchline." Leonardo projected his voice so it echoed in the cavernous hall. "She is not a joke. And if I ever hear a whisper, a chuckle, or a single breath of disrespect regarding her appearance, her weight, or her standing, I will not ask for an apology. I will take your tongue. I will take your businesses. And then I will wipe your entire bloodline from the face of this earth." He stared down the room. Mob bosses, hardened killers, and arrogant socialites all looked away, staring at their plates, the floor, the ceiling. Nobody breathed. Leonardo turned back to Isabella, who was now trembling violently, all the color gone from her face. "Leave," he whispered, "before I forget we have history." Isabella turned and practically ran from the ballroom. Leonardo sat back down. He calmly picked up a napkin, wiped his hand again, and poured himself another glass of water. He didn't look at Penelope. He just took a sip and said, "Eat your dinner. We have a long night ahead of us." Penelope sat frozen. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He hadn't defended her because he liked her. She knew that. He defended her because she belonged to him now, and no one insulted a possession of Leonardo Castiglione. But as she looked at the heavy gun sitting next to her plate, a strange, terrifying thrill coursed through her. For the first time in her entire life, someone had stood up for her. The ride to Leonardo's private estate in the Hudson Valley was cloaked in suffocating silence. The rain had picked up, beating a frantic rhythm against the tinted, bulletproof windows of the Maybach. Penelope sat pressed against the far door, trying to make herself as small as possible, an impossible feat in the sprawling, heavy wedding dress. Leonardo sat on the opposite side, nursing a glass of scotch from the car's minibar, his face illuminated intermittently by passing streetlights. He was scrolling through a secure tablet, already back to business. The wedding was over. The performance had concluded. Now, the harsh reality of their arrangement set in. "You can stop holding your breath," Leonardo said suddenly, not looking up from the screen. "You're making the air heavy." Penelope exhaled shakily. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize for breathing in my presence," he snapped, his tone sharp. He finally looked at her, his icy eyes scanning her rigid posture. "And stop cowering. I told you at the reception, you are a Castiglione now. My enemies will smell fear on you like blood in the water. I cannot afford a weak wife." "I am not weak," Penelope said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Leonardo arched an eyebrow. He set the tablet down. "Is that so?" "I survived 23 years in a house where I was treated like a diseased animal because I didn't fit into a sample size," she said, her voice trembling but gaining traction. "I survived a father who used me to pay off a gambling debt. I may be fat, Don Leonardo, but do not mistake my silence for stupidity or weakness." A heavy silence descended on the car. Penelope instantly regretted her outburst, pressing her hands against the seat, waiting for him to strike her or berate her. Instead, the corner of Leonardo's mouth twitched, the ghost of a smirk. "Good," he said softly. "Keep that fire. You're going to need it." They arrived at the estate, a sprawling, fortress-like mansion surrounded by high walls and armed guards. Inside, the house was modern, cold, and meticulously clean, blacks, greys, and chrome. It looked exactly like the man who owned it, unyielding and devoid of warmth. "Your quarters are upstairs," Leonardo said, handing his jacket to a silent butler. "The master suite. My men will bring your bags up. I have business in my study." Penelope frowned. "We aren't—" Leonardo stopped and turned back to her. He dragged his gaze deliberately down her body, taking in the massive dress, the flushed cheeks, the sheer exhaustion radiating from her. "I do not take terrified women to my bed, Penelope," he said coldly. "And I do not perform for the commission behind closed doors. You will sleep. Tomorrow, we establish the rules of this house." He walked away, leaving her standing in the grand foyer. Upstairs, the master suite was the size of Penelope's entire childhood apartment. A massive king-sized bed sat in the center. She walked into the walk-in closet and found her meager belongings already unpacked, looking pathetic next to Leonardo's rows of custom suits and expensive watches. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror and began the arduous process of undressing. She couldn't reach the heavy corset laces at her back. She struggled for 10 minutes, her arms burning, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. It was a humiliating metaphor for her life, trapped, suffocating, unable to free herself. Suddenly, the bedroom door clicked open. Heavy footsteps crossed the plush carpet. Penelope froze in the bathroom doorway as Leonardo walked in. He had removed his tie and unbuttoned his shirt, looking rougher, more dangerous. He saw her standing there, her face red, her hands awkwardly pinned behind her back. He deduced the problem instantly. "Turn around," he commanded. I can get it," she stammered, horrified at the thought of him seeing her back, the flesh spilling over the tight strings. "Penelope, turn around." It was an order, not a request. She slowly turned her back to him, closing her eyes in mortification. She felt his large, warm hands brush against her bare shoulders, sending a shiver down her spine. His fingers were surprisingly deft. He didn't mock her. He didn't make a sound of disgust. He methodically untied the intricate knots and loosened the lacing. As the corset gave way, Penelope took her first full, deep breath in 14 hours. The heavy dress slipped down, pooling at her waist. She stood in only her silk slip, her full figure exposed to the cold air of the room, and to him. She crossed her arms over her chest defensively. Leonardo didn't move away immediately. He stood right behind her, his chest inches from her back. She could feel his body heat. She looked up and met his eyes in the reflection of the vanity mirror. He wasn't looking at her with the revulsion she expected. His expression was unreadable, intense, his pale eyes tracking the curve of her neck, the slope of her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered to the mirror. "Get some sleep," he replied gruffly, stepping back, breaking the strange, charged tension. "Lock the door." He turned to leave. Crack. The sound was sharp, unnatural. Before Penelope could process it, the massive bay window of the bedroom shattered inward. A hail of suppressed gunfire tore through the room, shredding the drapes and tearing chunks of drywall into the air. "Down!" Leonardo roared. He lunged across the space, tackling Penelope to the floor. The sheer weight and force of his body drove the breath from her lungs as they hit the hardwood. Glass rained down on them like deadly hail. Leonardo rolled them behind the solid oak frame of the bed. He pulled a compact Glock from the holster at his ankle. His eyes were wild, the cold Mafia boss instantly replaced by a feral soldier. "Stay down!" he ordered, pressing a hand firmly against her back, keeping her pinned to the floor. More gunfire chewed through the room. Penelope pressed her hands over her ears, screaming as a bullet shattered a vase 3 feet away. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the bedroom was kicked open. 2 men dressed in tactical black stepped into the room, assault rifles raised. They weren't Castiglione men. Leonardo popped up from behind the bed, firing twice. The first man dropped, a bullet directly between his eyes. The second man fired wildly, forcing Leonardo back into cover. "He's behind the bed," the second man yelled to someone in the hallway. Leonardo cursed viciously in Italian. He checked his magazine. "I'm low," he muttered. He looked at Penelope, who was curled in a tight ball, trembling violently. "Penelope," he said sharply, grabbing her chin and forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me, I need to draw his fire. When I move left, you stay completely flat." "You'll die," she choked out, looking at the lethal determination in his eyes. The attacker was moving closer. Penelope could hear the heavy boots crunching on the broken glass. She looked frantically around her side of the bed, her eyes locked onto the nightstand. She remembered her father's house, the paranoia. She remembered her father always keeping a piece taped under the heavy furniture. Leonardo was a boss. He wouldn't leave himself unarmed in his own sanctum. Without thinking, driven by pure adrenaline and the desperate will to live, Penelope rolled away from Leonardo's grip. "What are you doing?" he hissed. She reached her arm under the heavy bedside table, her fingers frantically searching the dark space. Her hand brushed cold metal, a release lever. She ripped it downward. A hidden compartment dropped open, depositing a heavy, loaded Sig Sauer directly into her hand. The assassin rounded the corner of the bed, his rifle aimed down at Leonardo. He smiled beneath his mask. "Say hello to your father, Falcon," the assassin sneered. He didn't even notice the chubby girl in the torn silk slip on the floor. Penelope raised the gun, her hands shaking violently, closed her eyes, and pulled the trigger 3 times. The roar of the gun in the enclosed space was deafening. The assassin jerked backward as 2 hollow-point bullets struck his chest plate, and the third tore through his throat. He collapsed in a heap of blood and tactical gear, inches from Leonardo's boots. Silence slammed back into the room, broken only by the ringing in Penelope's ears and her own ragged, gasping breaths. The gun slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floor. She pushed herself back against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest, hyperventilating as she stared at the dead man's blood pooling on the rug. Leonardo slowly stood up. He kept his gun aimed at the door, but the hallway was quiet. Alarms were finally blaring downstairs. Shouts of Castiglione guards echoed through the house. The threat was neutralized. He turned and looked down at Penelope. He looked at the dead man, then at the hidden compartment under the nightstand, and then back to his new wife. The trembling, overweight girl that the entire underworld had written off as a pathetic joke had just saved his life with the cold efficiency of a seasoned killer. Leonardo holstered his weapon. He knelt down slowly in front of her, ignoring the blood and glass. He reached out and gently pulled her hands away from her face. His thumb brushed over a small cut on her cheek where flying glass had grazed her. The icy detachment in his eyes was completely gone. In its place was a burning, intense fire, a dangerous mixture of shock, respect, and something entirely new. "You found the blind spot safe," Leonardo murmured, his voice laced with absolute awe. Penelope swallowed hard, tears finally spilling over. "My father. He hid them the same way. I guessed." Leonardo leaned in, his face inches from hers. The smell of gunpowder hung thick between them. He cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones, gripping her with a fierce, undeniable possessiveness. "They thought they sent me a lamb," Leonardo whispered, his eyes locked onto hers, dark and promising. "But it seems, Maya Mowgli, they sent me a wolf in a very tight dress. Let's go find out who just declared war on us." The air in the master suite was thick with the acrid stench of cordite and copper. Within 90 seconds of the final gunshot, the hallway swarmed with Castiglione soldiers. Dante, Leonardo's stone-faced consigliere, burst through the shattered doorframe, an intricately engraved Colt M 1911 gripped in his fist. He took in the carnage, the shattered bay window, the bullet-riddled drywall, the two dead assassins, and his Don kneeling on the floor, holding the trembling, plus-size bride. "Secure the perimeter. Lock down the compound," Dante barked into a tactical radio, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the dead man at Leonardo's feet. "Leo, are you hit?" Leonardo didn't answer immediately. He kept his gaze fixed on Penelope, his hand still framing her face. Her breathing was frantic, her chest heaving against the torn, blood-spattered silk of her slip. She had just taken a life. In their world, that was a threshold you only crossed once. There was no going back. "I am unharmed," Leonardo finally said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stood up in one fluid motion, reaching down to grab Penelope by the waist. He didn't hesitate or struggle with her weight. He hoisted her up, his arm wrapping securely around her thick waist, pressing her flush against his side. My wife neutralized the threat. Dante's eyes widened a fraction as he looked from the heavy Sig Sauer on the floor to the terrified, full-figured woman tucked under his boss's arm. The silence from the doorway, where half a dozen hardened enforcers stood, was deafening. No one had expected Silvio Russo's useless daughter to pull a trigger, let alone put 3 perfect hollow points into a trained killer's chest plate and throat. "Get Dr. Harrison," Leonardo ordered, ignoring the stunned stares. "She's bleeding, and Dante, strip that trash." He pointed a polished Oxford shoe at the corpse. "Find out how they bypassed the thermal sensors. Nobody gets onto my estate without inside codes." Leonardo guided Penelope out of the ruined suite, leading her down the labyrinthine corridors of the estate to the reinforced safe room in the basement. It was a sterile, steel-walled bunker, outfitted with leather couches, a bank of security monitors, and a fully stocked medical bay. He sat her down on a leather gurney. Penelope wrapped her arms around her stomach, shivering violently as the adrenaline began to crash. She looked at her hands. They were smeared with the dead man's blood. "I killed him," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I actually killed him." Leonardo walked over to a stainless steel sink, soaked a clean white towel in warm water, and returned to her. He knelt between her thighs. Penelope instinctively tried to squeeze her legs together, acutely self-conscious of her bare, thick thighs exposed by the hiked-up silk, but Leonardo gently pushed her knees apart to step closer. "Look at me, Penelope," he commanded softly. She lifted her tear-filled brown eyes. "You survived," he corrected her, taking her shaking hands and carefully wiping the blood from her skin. His touch was meticulously gentle, a stark contrast to the brutal violence he was known for. "They came into our home to take my head and leave you as collateral damage. You did what a Donna does. You protected your family. Our home, your family." The words sent a strange, warm ache through Penelope's chest. Her own father had sold her to save his skin, but this ruthless mob boss was treating her like a partner. Dr. Harrison, an older man carrying a leather medical bag, hurried into the bunker. He cleaned the superficial glass cuts on Penelope's face and arms, applying butterfly bandages. When he requested to check her ribs for bruising, Penelope froze, panic flaring in her eyes at the thought of the doctor exposing her stomach and back. Leonardo noticed her immediate withdrawal. "Leave the salve, Harrison. I'll finish. Get upstairs and check my men." Once the doctor was gone, Leonardo picked up the gauze and the antiseptic cream. "Lift the slip," he said, his voice entirely devoid of judgment. Penelope's face burned. Leonardo, please. I'm not exactly something you want to look at. I know what I am." Leonardo paused. He set the medical supplies on the tray and leaned in, his pale blue eyes flashing with a sudden, intense heat. "Do not ever insult my wife in my presence again. Even if you are my wife." He reached out, his large hands gripping the hem of her slip. He slowly pulled it up over her head, leaving her in nothing but her lace bra and panties. Penelope squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away, waiting for the inevitable sigh of disgust, the cruel comment about her belly or the stretch marks on her hips. Instead, she felt the cool sting of the antiseptic on a cut near her rib cage. Leonardo's fingers lingered. They mapped the soft curve of her waist, the plush fullness of her stomach. He wasn't rushing. He was touching her with the reverence of a man handling a priceless, vulnerable artifact. "You spent your life surrounded by weak men who only understood bones and sharp edges," Leonardo murmured, pressing a sterile pad against a scratch on her shoulder. "I am not a weak man, Penelope. I like the softness. I like that there is more of you to hold. Do you understand me?" Penelope opened her eyes, breathless. He was looking at her body with undeniable dark hunger. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a monster. She felt dangerous. She felt desired. Before she could answer, Dante's voice cracked over the bunker's intercom. "Leo, you need to come upstairs. We found something on the hitter's encrypted comms. You're not going to like it." Leonardo's jaw clenched. The soft, intimate moment shattered, replaced instantly by the icy visage of Il Falco. "Rest," he told Penelope, grabbing an oversized black cashmere sweater from a nearby emergency wardrobe and handing it to her. "Put this on. Nobody comes in here but me." Morning broke over the Hudson Valley, casting a pale grey light over the heavily fortified Castiglione estate. Penelope hadn't slept. She sat curled on the leather sofa in the bunker, wearing Leonardo's massive cashmere sweater, which fell to mid-thigh, comfortably hiding her curves. The heavy steel door unlocked with a mechanical clunk. Leonardo walked in, carrying 2 steaming cups of black coffee. He looked exhausted. He was wearing the same dress pants from the wedding, his white shirt wrinkled and unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a dark smattering of chest hair and the edge of an old knife scar. "Drink," he said, pressing a cup into her hands. "Who sent them?" Penelope asked, the warmth of the mug grounding her. Leonardo sat beside her, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the concrete floor. He took a long drag of his coffee. The encryption on their burner phones was military grade, but Dante broke the local relay. The hit wasn't ordered by a rival family. It was sanctioned from inside. Penelope gasped. "Your own men?" "A splinter faction," Leonardo corrected, his voice dripping with venom. "Someone with enough power to hire ghost protocol mercenaries and provide them with my security grid codes. Someone who wants the Castiglione throne and thought catching me on my wedding night, distracted by a new, inexperienced bride, was their best window. Do you know who it is?" "I have my suspicions. We found a partial wire transfer routed through a shell company in the Caymans. The account is linked to the Core Club in Manhattan, a private social club." Leonardo turned his head to look at her. "My underboss, Carlo, practically lives there, and he was very vocal about his disapproval of the commission forcing me to marry a Russo." Penelope felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "He thought I made you look weak." "He thought wrong," Leonardo stated flatly. He stood up, pacing the length of the room. "I've called a war council. Every capo in the 5 boroughs is arriving in an hour. We are going to smoke the rat out. I need to look him in the eyes." "I'm coming with you," Penelope said. Leonardo stopped pacing. No, it's too dangerous. You stay in the bunker. Penelope set her coffee down and stood up. She pulled the oversized sweater tightly around herself. Her heart was hammering, but she forced her chin up. Last night, Isabella humiliated me in front of your entire syndicate. Today, your men think I was just cowering under a bed while you fought for your life. If I hide in a basement during a war council, I will forever be the Russo pig. I am your wife. You told me to act like a donna. Let me act like one. Leonardo stared at her. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. Dante! Leonardo shouted toward the intercom. Yeah, boss. Call Madame Beatrice. Tell her to get here in 30 minutes with her best tailors. And tell her if she brings another corset, I will cut off her fingers. 2 hours later, the grand dining room of the estate had been converted into a war room. 10 of the most dangerous, ruthless men in New York sat around the long mahogany table. The air was thick with tension and cigar smoke. Carlo, a thick-necked brute of a man with a scarred jaw, sat near the head of the table, looking entirely too relaxed for a man whose boss was nearly assassinated. The double doors opened. The room fell dead silent. Leonardo walked in, wearing a sharp, charcoal-grey Brioni suit, his presence commanding absolute obedience. But it wasn't Leonardo who drew their stares. It was the woman walking beside him. Penelope wore a custom, deep emerald wrap dress made of heavy crepe silk. Madame Beatrice had worked a miracle in record time, abandoning the restrictive structures of the wedding dress for a design that actually celebrated Penelope's body. The dress draped elegantly over her full hips, cinched naturally at her waist, and featured a plunging neckline that accentuated her generous curves. Her dark, unruly curls were pinned back on one side with a diamond clip, and her lips were painted a dark crimson. She didn't look like a scared, overweight girl hiding in a pantry. She looked like a Mafia queen. Leonardo pulled out the heavy oak chair to his immediate right, the seat traditionally reserved for the underboss. Carlo frowned, his face darkening as he was forced to slide down a seat to make room for her. Don Leonardo, Carlo began, his voice gravelly. With all due respect, this is family business. It's no place for a woman, especially not a Russo. Leonardo didn't sit. He planted both hands on the table and leaned toward Carlo. My wife's name is Castiglione, and considering she is the one who put a bullet through the throat of the assassin who breached my bedroom last night, she has earned her seat at this table more than anyone else in this room. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the capos. Eyes widened. Hardened killers stared at the soft, plus-size woman with newfound, wary respect. Penelope kept her face perfectly neutral, masking the absolute terror churning inside her. She held Leonardo's icy gaze, drawing strength from him. Now, Leonardo said, taking his seat, let's talk about the core club, the Cayman Islands, and which one of you is going to bleed first. The air in the dining room turned to ash in the lungs of every man present. Leonardo Castiglione did not make empty threats, and the heavy, suppressed Sig Sauer, sitting by Penelope's right hand, was a stark reminder of the new world order. Carlo shifted in his seat, the leather creaking loudly in the dead silence. He wiped a bead of sweat from his thick neck. Boss, the core club is a big place. Politicians, Wall Street guys, half the syndicate drinks there. Tying a Cayman wire to me just because I hold court in the VIP lounge is a stretch. It's a setup. Leonardo leaned back, steepling his fingers. A setup, Carlo? My head of security found a ghost protocol frequency pinging off the estate's grid at exactly 2 a.m. The only people with the rolling clearance codes are sitting at this table, and Dante. Dante stood by the double doors, a statue carved from granite, his hand resting on the butt of his holster. "My logs are clean, boss. But Carlo's sector in Queens had a blackout in their ledger 2 days ago. 300 grand unaccounted for. Cash. That was for the docks." Carlo slammed his fist on the mahogany table, making the crystal water glasses tremble. "We had to grease the union bosses, you know this." Penelope sat perfectly still. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her face was an unreadable mask. Years of being the invisible, fat girl in the corner had taught her one invaluable skill: observation. When people thought you were worthless, they didn't bother hiding their true faces from you. She had watched her father lie, cheat, and sweat his way through 100 dangerous meetings. She knew the anatomy of a desperate man. She looked at Carlo. She looked at his hands, thick and calloused, trembling just a fraction of an inch. Then she noticed his watch, a custom Patek Philippe, rose gold with a diamond bezel. It was a beautiful piece, worth at least $250,000. But it wasn't the watch that caught her attention. It was the scent wafting from Carlo as he grew hotter and more agitated. It was a very distinct, heavy perfume. Tom Ford's black orchid mixed with cheap, acrid fear. Penelope closed her eyes for a split second, transported back to the wedding reception. Isabella Romano, leaning over the head table, her cleavage pushed up, dripping in diamonds and smelling exactly like black orchid. "It wasn't just the union bosses, was it, Carlo?" Penelope's voice sliced through the heavy, masculine shouting. The entire room snapped to look at her. Carlo's eyes narrowed into dark, hateful slits. "Keep your mouth shut, little girl. The adults are talking." Leonardo's hand shot out, grabbing Carlo by the throat and slamming his head down onto the polished mahogany with a sickening crack. Half the capos jumped to their feet, chairs scraping violently against the floor. Dante drew his weapon, aiming it squarely at Carlo's chest. "Sit down," Leonardo hissed, his voice a lethal whisper. The capos slowly lowered themselves back into their seats. Leonardo didn't let go of Carlo. He turned his head toward Penelope. "Speak, Mia Regina." "My queen!" The title sent a surge of pure electricity through her veins. "My father," Penelope started, her voice steadying as she looked down at the bleeding underboss, "owed $4 million. Everyone assumed it was to the Albanians. But my father hated the Albanians. He only gambled at the underground tables in Queens. Your tables, Carlo." Carlo gurgled, trying to pry Leonardo's iron grip from his windpipe. "You didn't want Leonardo to marry me because it wiped my father's slate clean. It cost you $4 million in leverage," Penelope continued, her mind connecting the puzzle pieces with terrifying clarity. "And you needed that money to pay the Ghost Protocol mercenaries. But you didn't do it alone. You don't have the brains to bypass a military-grade security grid." She stood up, the heavy silk of her emerald dress pooling around her curves. She walked around the table, her heels clicking methodically on the hardwood floor until she stood directly behind Carlo. "Isabella Romano gave you the codes," Penelope said, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. She was Leonardo's associate. She had access to the estate. She had access to the private servers. She felt spurned, and you felt robbed. So you pooled your resources. Carlo's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. "You're smelling of her perfume right now, Carlo," Penelope whispered, leaning down. "Black orchid. She was with you this morning, wasn't she? Waiting to hear if I was dead." With a roar of desperate rage, Carlo reached into his jacket, pulling a snub-nosed revolver. He swung wildly backward toward Penelope. He never even cocked the hammer. Leonardo drew his Beretta and fired a single deafening shot. The bullet caught Carlo perfectly in the temple. The underboss slumped forward, his blood pooling rapidly across the polished mahogany, staining scattered financial ledgers and crystal glasses. Screams echoed from the hallway as the estate guards rushed the room, but Leonardo raised a single bloody hand. "Stand down." The war room was a tomb. The remaining capos stared at Carlo's corpse, and then they slowly, almost reverently, turned their gazes to Penelope. She hadn't flinched. She stood tall, her breathing even, looking down at the man who had tried to have her murdered in her sleep. Leonardo holstered his weapon. He walked over to Penelope, uncaring of the blood on his hands, and pulled her against his chest. He kissed her forehead, a brand of absolute ownership and pride. "Dante," Leonardo commanded, his eyes sweeping the terrified room. "Take a crew to the city. Find Isabella Romano. Take her to the Pine Barrens. She does not see tomorrow's sunrise." "Yes, boss," Dante said, his voice thick with newfound respect. "And as for the rest of you," Leonardo said, his gaze hardening into diamonds, "you have just witnessed the intellect and the instinct of Donna Penelope Castiglione. If any man in this syndicate questions her authority, her mind, or her place at my side, they will share Carlo's fate. Are we clear?" "Yes, Don Leonardo," the capos murmured in unison, their heads bowed respectfully. "Good. Get this trash out of my dining room." The estate was quiet again, the scent of bleach and ozone replacing the metallic tang of blood. The storm outside had finally broken, leaving the Hudson Valley bathed in the soft, bruised light of dusk. Penelope stood in the newly relocated master suite on the top floor. The shattered bay window of the old room was a memory of violence she was eager to leave behind. She stood in front of a massive, gilded floor mirror, staring at her reflection. The emerald dress was stunning, but she felt the familiar, creeping anxiety of her own skin underneath it. The adrenaline of the War Council had faded, leaving her drained and vulnerable. She was a Mafia queen today, but she was still Penelope Russo, the girl who was too soft, too round, too much. The heavy oak door clicked open, and Leonardo stepped inside. He had showered. He wore only a pair of dark silk sweatpants that hung low on his hips, his muscular, heavily tattooed chest bare. The brutal enforcer was gone. In his place was a man looking at his wife with a hunger that made Penelope's breath catch in her throat. He locked the door behind him. "You were magnificent today," Leonardo said, his voice a low, gravelly hum as he crossed to the room. "I was terrified," Penelope admitted, looking down at her hands. "Fear is a biological response, Penelope. Courage is what you do with it. And you, Mia Cara, have more courage than any man who sat at that table." He stopped behind her, their eyes meeting in the mirror. He reached out, his large, warm hands resting on her hips. He slowly traced the curve of her waist, his thumbs pressing into the soft flesh of her stomach through the silk. "I know what you've been told your whole life," Leonardo murmured, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "I know they made you feel less than because you didn't look like the starved, hollowed-out women they parade around. But they are fools." He reached for the tie of the wrap dress. Penelope instinctively reached back to stop him, a sudden wave of panic hitting her. "Leo, please," she whispered, a tear escaping her eye. I'm not beautiful underneath this. I have rolls. I have marks. I'm fat." Leonardo caught her wrists in one hand, pinning them gently but firmly against her stomach. With his free hand, he pulled the tie. The heavy emerald silk parted, sliding off her shoulders and pooling on the floor, leaving her in nothing but her lace undergarments. He didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He turned her around to face him. "Look at me," he commanded softly. She opened her eyes, tears spilling over her cheeks. "You are a feast in a world of famine," Leonardo said, his pale blue eyes blazing with absolute adoration and dark, consuming lust. He dropped to his knees in front of her. Penelope gasped as he pressed a reverent, open-mouthed kiss directly to the soft, rounded swell of her stomach. "Leo," she breathed, her hands burying themselves in his dark hair. "Every mark," he murmured, his lips trailing down to her hip bone, tracing a silvery stretch mark with his tongue, "is a testament to your survival. Every curve is mine to worship. You are not a defect, Penelope. You are a goddess, and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never forget it." He stood up, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. He carried her to the massive, plush bed, laying her down against the dark velvet sheets. The cold, ruthless head of the Castiglione family was completely undone by the soft, full-figured girl they had tried to use as a pawn. That night, there was no violence, no fear, no hesitation. There was only the absolute, undeniable claiming of a queen. Leonardo touched her with a desperate reverence, exploring every inch of her lush body, pulling breathless moans from her lips and replacing her lifetime of insecurities with a blazing, fierce confidence. He worshipped her softness, proving with every touch, every kiss, and every whispered promise that she was exactly what he wanted. Conclusion. In the ruthless, blood-soaked world of La Cosa Nostra, legends were written in violence and fear, but the legacy of Leonardo and Penelope Castiglione was forged in fire and unyielding loyalty. The Russo pig did not just survive the falcon's nest, she became its undisputed queen. Together, they purged the syndicate of its rot, expanding their empire with Leonardo's lethal execution and Penelope's brilliant, calculating mind. Those who had once sneered at her weight now bowed before her intellect, terrified of the woman who could dismantle an empire with a single glance. She wore her curves not as a badge of shame, but as armor, wholly adored by a monster who would burn the world to ashes just to keep her warm. Their reign proved that true power doesn't reside in hollow perfection, but in the unbreakable strength of a woman who finally recognizes her own worth.